Hi there, it's Elaine Buchanan. As someone who regularly teaches the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, in both academic and popular settings, I get asked a lot of questions about Scripture, especially in relation to things like being a female minister, in regards to being a female with a PhD in biblical studies area. I get asked a lot of questions about military culture and lifestyle, lots of questions about academia, questions about being a mom, questions about pretty much everything under the sun. I get asked questions about those things, which is totally awesome. But today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to answer one question that I get asked regularly in regards to the Old Testament. But in order to answer that question, I also need to tell you a little bit about the way I understand Scripture and the way I approach Scripture. So here are a couple of things that are really, really important to me when I'm looking at Scripture and trying to understand Scripture. First of all, one of the things that I truly believe about all of Scripture is that every single person, every single situation, every single event matters a lot to God. They matter a lot to God. And in addition to that, God cares very much about people having a relationship with God and people having good, positive relationships with each other. So those are probably the biggest driving beliefs that I have outside of Jesus being the Son of God and all of those different types of things that are connected with that. Yes, I do believe those things. But in addition to that, really this idea, this focus and this concern that God cares about each individual person and the situations that they go through. And that all of that matters to God, that all people, all lives matter to Jesus, that they matter to God. That is the biggest driving force behind the way that I look at and the way that I read Scripture. So a lot of times within Christian settings, we focus a lot on Jesus, which is wonderful. That's the way it should be. At the same time, oftentimes we forget that God truly does care about individuals, that God truly does care about people in their situations. But one of the problems, one of the issues that we have a tendency to have within Christianity is that we ignore the Old Testament, or we only look at the parts of the Old Testament that we think relate to Jesus. But I think that God cares about all people, which means that I think God cares about the people, all the people throughout the Old Testament. God cares about all people from the beginning of time. God cares about you. He cares about me. He cares about everybody. And so because of that, people, all cultures, deserve to be researched. They deserve to be studied. They deserve to be understood. So because of that, and because I truly, firmly do believe that God cares and that all lives do truly matter to God, because of that, I have a tendency to, in regards to the Old Testament, to allow the text to speak for itself. In other words, I don't look at it per se through the lens of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. The way I look at it is that I start at the beginning and I try to understand the people, the cultures, the contexts. And then that leads into the New Testament and who Jesus is and the way that people in the New Testament interpret the Old Testament. But I think that we've missed out a lot in the church because of our neglect of the people and the cultures of the Old Testament. So when I'm teaching Old Testament classes or when I'm preaching or speaking or anything about the Old Testament, I have a tendency to want to focus on helping people understand the people that we're reading about or that we're talking about. So understanding cultures, understanding the story, of the Old Testament and how all of these people are connected together and what's happening and why, and all of those things. Because I firmly believe that a lot of the things that were happening in the times of the Old Testament, a lot of the things that were being written about in the Old Testament from a literary perspective, they still relate very much to people today. So that is how I tend to approach the Old Testament, generally speaking. Now, sometimes people will say, I know nothing about the Old Testament, or I know very little about the Old Testament, and I'd like to know more, and I want to know what's in there, and I want to know why it's in there, but I don't have time to go to school. I don't have time to take an extra degree. I just don't have time or the money or the finances for those things. So I have a couple of books that I want to show to you that I think will be really, really helpful in understanding the people and the culture of the Old Testament a little bit better. But with that being said, there really truly isn't anything that takes the place of good, solid research, attending classes, participating in classes, starting groups of people where you can study Scripture together. Nothing takes the place of those things. But with that being said, I have a couple of resources to show you and to just talk about briefly that I think will really, really help all of us in understanding the Old Testament people and the cultures just a little bit better. So first, I want to show you this book. This is The Ancient Near East, and it's by John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin. Let me see if I can get it up there right. So The Ancient Near East by John McLaughlin. What I like a lot about this particular book is that it goes over the different people, the cultures, the customs of different people groups throughout the Old Testament times. So if you're reading something and all of a sudden there's something in there about the Cushites or about, who else is there? There's so many. About the Moabites, about all different kinds of people groups. Those are going to be explained right here. And this particular book is written at a popular level, which means that it should be fairly easily understood by most people. So anyway, if you have the chance, get this particular book. It's called The Ancient Near East by John McLaughlin. And again, it's about the people and the cultures of the Old Testament. Okay, so very important to me. All right, the next book that I want to recommend to you is called this. It's called Telling the Old Testament Story, God's Mission and God's People by Brad E. Kelly. By Brad E. Kelly. And the reason I like this one is because it tells the Old Testament through story. And really, that's what a lot of the Old Testament is. It's written in a story format, or the connections that are there are in story format. So basically what he does is he walks through the Old Testament and tells the overall picture, the overall story of the Old Testament. So this is a really, really great book as well. And together, these two books really do a good job of giving a broad overview at a popular level, at an understandable level, in regards to the people and the story and what's going on in the Old Testament. So I encourage you, please do get one of those two books. Incidentally, nobody's paying me to say this. Nobody's giving me any sort of anything for this. I'm just recommending some books that I think are really, really good and solid that most people can understand. So these two books in particular, again, very good, very solid, and hopefully if you have the chance to take a look at those, hopefully there will be things in the Old Testament that stick out to you and then that make a little bit more sense. All right, so if you have any other questions, and again, it can be about anything under the sun, and as long as I'm comfortable answering it, I will be more than happy to do so. And just remember that no matter what happens, who you are, what you do matters to God, because all lives matter to Jesus. See you later.